Welcome to Blind Spots, a podcast where we're helping you fill the gap between what you want to do with your money and what you actually do. We are professional investors, writers, and financial planners helping you navigate the complexities of finance to optimize what you can control and cut out the rest. Join your host, Nick Shermans and Aaron Varghese, as we discuss the questions and nuances surrounding everyday money management. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Blind Spots. In today's episode, we are going to be talking all about risk tolerance versus risk capacity. So we're going to tell you what the heck that means and then break it down for you.
Yeah, so there's the academic side of it, which Aaron can explain what risk tolerance is. And many of you that have worked with an advisor have probably gone through an exercise, which I absolutely hate. I think it's completely broken, but she's going to explain what it actually is. And then I'll tell you how it works in practice. I've seen the movie over and over and over again. And I think this is relevant as people try to pick up the pieces from a difficult 2022. Caught a lot of folks off guard. We were coming off a decade plus of pretty good returns. And all of a sudden, everything that we've known to be true, low inflation gave way to higher inflation, low rates gave way to high rates, stocks performing well gave way to the worst bear market we've seen in some time. So if you're looking backwards and you're trying to become a more efficient and rational investor, I think this could help you.
Okay, so I'll give you the academic description of risk tolerance first. So this one that I pulled says that risk tolerance is a state of mind and can fluctuate wildly in response to the market. So tell us how you saw this in 2022.
Well, I can tell you how most advisors capture a client's risk tolerance. They slide over a piece of paper, or they send you an email that says, the market fell by 20%. Would you A, buy more, B, do nothing, C, sell your whole portfolio? And most people, even if they're very conservative in nature, click A or B, either do nothing or buy more. And they click those buttons because they know because they know that's what they're supposed to do. But what's missing in this whole process is it's impossible to recreate the fear and greed that come with the market sell-off, and mainly the fear, not so much greed, but the fear, the emotion, the panic, 24/7 news cycle, your friends telling you things are going to get worse. You can't recreate that by filling out a PDF or filling out a piece of paper.
So how do we do it here at Pure Portfolios?
So I will be the first to say that the entire risk profile, risk questionnaire process is broken, but it's getting better. And I think we offer the best solution in a world of imperfect solutions. So what we do up here is really a few things. One, most people know what risk is, but it's hard to quantify in the terms of an investment portfolio. Okay. So we clearly state, based on how much someone has invested, if they're invested, what their potential range of outcomes is. And that's a fancy way of saying, what in dollars and percent could this portfolio go down in value based on how you're answering a series of questions? Let's say you've got $1 million invested and the downside scenario is a loss of $100,000 or minus 10%. People can grasp that because it's tangible, okay? The second thing that we do, and this blows a lot of people's minds, is we don't talk about risk in the context of a 10 or 20-year period. We bring risk forward, okay? And we show them those range of outcomes that I just mentioned in a period of 6 months. And a lot of people say, hey, Nick, that really doesn't make sense. I'm conditioned to be a long-term investor. What we found in practice is it's really hard to get to the long-term if someone doesn't understand the range of short-term outcomes. So we show it in percentage and dollar figure loss, and we bring risk forward. Okay, that's the main difference. And in practice, it does work better. It's still imperfect. Like you think you know somebody based on their risk score, and then the stuff hits the fan and they start acting a little bit a little irrationally, and you go back and say, hey, this was a potential outcome, and they don't really care. That's back to my first point. It's hard to recreate fear and emotion and all of these things when the stuff is hitting the fan.
Yeah, I think in practice, for example, going into 2022, a lot of people were back on, ready to take on risk. Markets were up, everything was great. And just in this one example, we had a client who retired at the beginning of 2022. Going into the year, it was really easy to say, sure, I'll take on risk if my portfolio is down 20%, no problem. But when you retire, you're living on fixed income, you've got a finite amount of money. Seeing your portfolio down 20% doesn't feel good if you've just retired. So at that point, a lot of times we see someone's risk tolerance start to fluctuate because they're experiencing that in real time.
Well, and there's bias here too. So in a background, again, the last 10 or 12 years, it's been easy to be a risk-seeking investor. It's been easy to be an equity investor. So people were lulled into this false sense of security that, hey, I'm a risk-seeking investor. It's really hard to see my neighbor making 10% a year when I'm sitting in a short-term bond portfolio. So a lot of really conservative investors, risk-averse investors, got caught up in the background of stocks going up year over year over year. They thought they were all equity investors. And then once things got difficult, they abandoned ship. And I can tell you, if you thought you were a 100% equity investor and you sold or panicked during the sell-off of 2022, you are not a 100% equity investor, because a true 100% equity investor understands negative outcomes are part of investing. They understand negative 30% is a potential outcome. So we would encourage those folks to go back, have a difficult conversation with themselves, examine your behavior, examine the things that you were saying before stock sold off and what you were doing after stock sold off.
If you are a DIY investor and you don't know how to quantify risk, we have our risk tolerance questionnaire linked in the description of this podcast, so you can actually go through it. You'll receive an output that tells you, right, what your range of outcomes are, and kind of a correlating number. It looks like a speed limit sign. Now, you may not understand what that speed limit sign means. That means more to us probably than to you, but that range of outcomes is what you're really looking for. So you can use that if you need help quantifying risk, if you're a DIY investor.
Well, and the second step to that, once you identify your range of acceptable outcomes, we can actually build a portfolio for you that reflects that. So if you don't understand how to take your risk number and use it in practice, that's what we do. We build a portfolio that closely mirrors that range of acceptable outcomes. I could say one more thing about this too, because I think this is really important. So what I just described, identifying your range of acceptable outcomes before something happens and building a portfolio that reflects that range of acceptable outcomes, that's 80 to 90% of sound investing. Okay. A lot of people think that you just have a portfolio, you take as much risk as you possibly can, markets go down, that's the time to go back to the drawing board and make a bunch of changes. That is emotional, knee-jerk market timing. That's a horrible, broken process. But that's how most people approach this. So good investing is process heavy. You're doing your best to build a sound process. It could look different. You could be a dividend investor, you could be a value investor, you could be a growth investor. But every professional investor, every successful investor has a framework for making decisions. They don't read the latest headline and go in and make a bunch of trades. They don't see the market's been down 10% or see a position's at a loss and make a bunch of trades and make a bunch of changes. That's emotional market timing. That's a broken process. So I would encourage you, tighten up your process. Good investing starts today. Build a portfolio that reflects the way that you feel about risk. Be honest with yourself about your not only capacity, which Aaron's going to talk about, but your true risk profile.
Let's move on to risk capacity. So Nick didn't really like my definition, but I'm going to give it to you anyways.
Risk capacity, on the other hand, is fixed. Your goals have an end date, and you either have time to bounce back from your losses or you don't. So tell us in layman's terms what that means.
So this is Aaron's wheelhouse, right? So this is basically your financial plan's capacity to take on risk. And we're talking about markets here. So we're talking about your investments. So what's the max stress your investment portfolio could take in any given year or any series of years before your plan breaks? So we're basically looking for your plan's breaking point. And I like to use extremes to drive a point home. So let's say I'm a client and I have $100 million. Okay. My capacity to take risk, you can actually go both ways here. Like you could say, Nick, you're set for life. You've got $100 million. You could make a strong case for not taking risk at all. Because if I take my 100 million, turn it into 150 million, it's not going to change my life, right? If I take my 150 or I take my 100 million and I turn it into 20 million, I might have some PTSD. I might not be able to do the things that I set out to do. Okay. So you can make a very strong case for not taking risk in that example. On the flip side, if I'm 85 years old and have $100 million and I don't have any kids, I could make a very strong case for taking a boatload of risk because my money is going to go to charity. It's going to go to my favorite college. It's going to go to my brother's kids who are 5 and 7 years old. Okay, that run rate is a lot longer. So I could embrace risk. I could speculate. I could do all these things. That's completely fine too. I don't know if that example helps or hurts your cause.
I think it helps, but we always say that investing and your financial plan go hand in hand. This is where the two intersect. So maybe let's do some examples. So we've seen clients who are kind of skating on thin ice. They barely have enough saved to live off of. So their risk capacity is quite low. They need to preserve those assets. On the other hand, they might have a high risk tolerance. They might say, if my portfolio goes down, fine, I'm okay taking on that risk because I know the upside is much higher. And that's great, but that can be your greatest downfall because your capacity to take risk, your potential time frame to make up those losses may be what is detrimental to your plan. Let's say your portfolio is down 50% and you turned your $1 million into 500,000, but you still have 30 years left to live. You're probably not going to have enough money at the end of your life. That's where these things start playing.
Well, and it works on the opposite end too, right? So say you're a super conservative investor and you're spending 5 or 6% or 7% out of your portfolio each year, and you're parked in cash that's generating 3 to 4%, and then inflation on top of that. So you actually need your assets to grow to supplement your lifestyle, but you're super conservative. That capacity to take risk actually pushes you the other way.
Yeah.
Right. So you're bucking your risk profile, your risk tolerance, because your plan doesn't support staying hunkered down. Okay. So there's really two parts to this. And I think this conversation is fascinating because there's what happens in practice and what actually an academic textbook says. But I think step one is more art than science, right? It's your own personal experiences, your biases, maybe how your parents thought about money. That all rolls into how your risk profile or risk tolerance is. Your risk capacity, that's more black and white. That's nuts and bolts. That's your financial plan. How much stress, how much risk can your plan take, or how much conservatism, being hunkered down, can your plan not take? So it's a matter of finding that balance.
What's your little saying about the worst case scenario?
Oh, taking risk where the best case scenario won't change your life, but the worst case will completely put you on the street. I think that's relevant. I think you should look at every decision that you make in investing and planning with that lens Because a lot of people, as we've talked about in previous blogs and podcasts, they spend their whole lives building wealth and creating wealth. And the skill set for building wealth and keeping wealth are completely different. And a lot of folks forget to turn the lever down, to downshift. Like once you're done, you've punched out, you're finally going to retire. You don't need to reach for return. You don't need to take on debt. You don't need to seek risk or speculate or squeeze out every ounce of return. Yet a lot of people fail to make that transition. And I think it's probably one of the biggest pitfalls that we see in working with our clients.
Mm-hmm. To give some kind of takeaways for someone who is taking on more risk than what they maybe expected to, now their portfolio is down 20%, what do you tell that person?
So they've thought they were a risk-seeking investor. They've gotten burned. They might have sold out, right? So maybe they're sitting in cash or they're scared of their own shadow. What would I say to that person?
Yeah.
Be honest about your capacity to take on risk. I can tell you, clients with the best outcomes, investors with the best outcomes are honest, and they have a high self-awareness about their capacity to take on risk. And I'll give you two examples. One is the conservative investor. They tell us that they're conservative. We build a conservative portfolio. Market goes down by 20%. They're usually okay because they have modest equity exposure and their portfolio is conservative. So if the market's down by 20%, they might be down 4 or 5%. Okay, that's fine. On the other end, an aggressive investor, open and candid about their capacity to take risk. I'm a 100% equity investor. All right. Market goes down by 20%. They fully understand negative outcomes are part of investing. It's the cost of admission. They might have lived through 2008 where stocks were down 37%. They understand at that point, future returns are usually highest going forward. Okay. So we build an aggressive portfolio. Markets go down, they get that, they either add more or they stay the course. There's no freaking out. Like if you're freaking out and looking to make a bunch of changes, you didn't do the right work up front today. You were lying to yourself. You weren't honest about your capacity to take on risk. The concept of investing and enjoying gains while shunning risk and shunning losses is not a thing. That does not exist. The best investors on the planet get it wrong. The best investors on the planet trail a benchmark. The best investors on the planet get blown up from time to time. Okay, it's the cost of admission. You can't get 10% a year. You can't get market returns without the occasional blip. More money and more mistakes are made by trying to jump in and out of markets and avoid losses. Every behavioral bias that we talked about comes from trying to avoid losses. Get that out of your head. That is destructive behavior. Rant over.
Preach. I was going to say, I feel like I'm in church. Okay. That was my only other question on that. Any last
it triggered me. It
or
triggered me.
recalls?
I feel triggered. I feel like that was entrapment.
No, it was good.
So I don't know if you want to put a bow on this and summarize what we've talked about: risk tolerance, risk capacity, or should we just quit talking?
Okay. To put a bow on it, understand the difference between your capacity to take risk, how much your financial plan can realistically handle, and your risk tolerance, how you really feel about how your portfolio and investments are reacting to market movement. If you get that right.
So risk tolerance is art. That's the way that you view the world. That's your emotional baggage, your blind spots, your biases. The market goes down by 20%. How are you really going to act? And know that most advisors, it's impossible to recreate the fear and emotion that comes with the market pullback. Mm-hmm. So a good mental shortcut to do if you're trying to build the right portfolio for you and you don't feel like a piece of paper and a bunch of stale questions can do the job, look back at your past behavior. So a lot of folks that we work with are retired. So they've lived through 2000 and 2001. They lived through a 2008. If you made emotional decisions during that time period and sold stocks or sold blew out of your entire portfolio, you're probably not that type of investor. So you were probably taking too much risk. You're probably a little more conservative. You might dial it back a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's great. The only other thing I would add is continuing to check in on your risk tolerance. So we, from our risk questionnaire, it sends out a quarterly check-in to our clients. And usually people are probably kind of in the same area depending on what day it is. But sometimes those responses come back and they're wildly off from what we had originally talked about. And that's a great trigger for us to re-engage the conversation, talk about how our clients are feeling, and just reconnect.
Well, and it's not a surprise. So I'm the one that gets those, and I look at the responses, and I can go back and track responses for the last 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
When the market is up, people feel great. It's all green. There's a green check mark saying I feel great.
Yeah.
Markets are down. It's all red. I feel horrible. I'm destitute. Yada yada.
Yeah.
So there's a very real human component to all this. That's why I don't really like the academic side of risk tolerance and questionnaires and yada yada, because again, you just can't unpack everything and recreate the emotion that comes with a market sell-off. And it's worse than it ever has been too, because again, we're human cyborgs. Like, you can't escape the negative news cycle. You just can't. And if that's the way that you lean, or if you're worried about what comes next, like, you're not going to get hit with how things could get better. You're going to get hit with how things could go awry, and that causes people to get triggered and flare up and want to make changes and all that good stuff.
I think that's a pretty good bow. Okay. Thanks for listening to this episode of Blind Spots. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at insight@pureportfolios.com. If you would like to take a risk questionnaire or our risk questionnaire, click the link in the description, and we will see you in the next one.